Eden is a teaching fellow at the Brick Church School in New York City. Her current work focuses on meta-ethics of intergroup empathy and pre-biblical Afro-Eurasian oral poetry and its implications for the reimagining of social justice. I am absolutely fascinated to hear this talk. Thank you so much for joining us. Eden, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully, I think this is able to be seen. So today I'm going to talk about two narratives, one ancient and one modern, and how they construct the past. So the ancient one is the Homeric epic known as the Odyssey. The modern one is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. The Odyssey presents the dangers of historicity in the famous episode of the Sirens. The Great Gatsby echoes those same dangers by presenting its lead female character, Daisy Buchanan, as a Homeric siren herself. So my basic argument is this. These two works, 3,000 years apart, share a common construction of the past, and especially of its destructive lore. In both texts, narrator heroes must overcome the siren lore of the past to achieve a nostos, a return. So I'll speak first about the fatal past in the Odyssey and what it means to be human in the context of time. Women in the Western literary tradition are often presented as temptress monsters, and the sirens are an enduring form of that archetype. Half bird and half human, sirens are enchanting songstresses who live on an island and lure sailors to their deaths. Their siren song, as Margaret Atwood says, is something that nobody knows but everyone wants to learn. And the reason no one knows the song is that no one survives hearing it. Well, almost no one. Crafty Odysseus lives to tell the tale in Homer's Odyssey. The Sirens episode can be summarized as follows. Odysseus and his crew arrive suddenly at the Sirens' Island. A mysterious calm ensues. The crew plug their ears with wax, tie Odysseus to the mast, and row the ship close to shore. The Sirens sit in a meadow that hides the bones of their victims. They sing, "Come here, Odysseus, famed for your many riddling words. You great glory to the Achaean name. Stop your ship so that you may hear our voices. No man has ever yet sailed past us with his dark ship without staying to hear the sweet sound of the voices that come from our mouths. And he who listens will not only experience great pleasure before he goes back home, but will also be far more knowledgeable than before. For we know everything that happened at Troy, that expansive place, all the sufferings caused by the gods for the Argives and the Trojans, and know everything on earth, that nurture of so many mortals, everything that happens." Unable to resist the siren's lure, Odysseus motions for his men to cut them free. But by prearrangement, his crew can only bind him tighter, and they sail safely past the siren's isle. Scholars have wrestled with a long time with the questions about the sirens' allure. For example, is it their voices themselves which are enchanting, or does the enchantment come from what they sing about? Do they cater to each individual in what they promise to sing? How do sailors die on the Sirens' Island? Do they starve to death while listening, so enthralled that they forget to eat? Or do the sirens themselves perhaps eat their victims? Do the sirens, like muses, really know everything? Or is this a false promise, part of their deceptive lore? An influential approach to these questions is the 1979 analysis of Pietro Pucci, which has informed more recent readings by Gregory Nagy and others. To Pucci, the sirens are the evil twins of the muses. They speak with the diction of the Iliad, and they appeal to Odysseus' nostalgia for his glorious past deeds at Troy. As Nagy says, that is why their song would bring Odysseus out of his own epic, the Odyssey, to rot on their island. To get home, he must get past his past. The siren song is an invitation to live in the past, suggests Bernard Knox, and that is a kind of death. Where the lotus makes the traveler forget everything, the sirens promise to recall everything. In both cases, an unbalanced relationship to memory impedes return. The great danger is stasis. The stunting of movement and growth is represented by the dying winds near the Siren's Isle. Freud talks about neuroses as psychic troops we leave behind to fight battles which ended long ago. and that condition aptly describes Odysseus's compulsion to relive Troy. It's a condition common to many latter-day warriors trying to find their way home. The danger is universal. All men in Homer's glory-mad world, including Odysseus and his crew, are susceptible to false promises. The sirens will spellbind any man alive, whoever comes their way, and whoever draws too close. The sirens tempt the Homeric hero because they tap into his psyche. Nostalgia compels Odysseus to relive his exploits in a drinking party that spans 4 books of the Odyssey. When the Achaeans enter Achilles' tent in Iliad 9, they find him singing the tales of famous men. Homer's heroes are lived by what Jonas Grethlein calls epic plupasts. They're striving for immortality by becoming a sign or sema of something. Yet this quest for future glory based on past exploits can be a prison in the present. In the Iliad, King Priam cannot bury his beloved son Hector until he travels to the Achaean camp, passing the tomb of his grandfather Ilus. Likewise, Achilles, to resolve his wrath, must stop what Gregory Nagy calls mourning for ancestors by the way of Patroclus, whose name means he who has the glory, kleos, of the ancestors. A defining danger of Homeric heroism is the difficulty of moving beyond time, which has become a kind of place. In this sense, the Odyssey implicitly criticizes the idea of caring so much about the last war. Perhaps the Sirens episode is even a critique of the whole tradition of singing about war. Perhaps the Odyssey is a commentary on the Iliad. Most scholars say that the Iliad came first, implying that if the same poet wrote both, he composed the Iliad when younger and the Odyssey when older. This opens the possibility of competition between the 2 poems. Maybe a matured and domesticated poet is revising the warlike worldview of his earlier work. But if the epic past is presented as a danger, what does this tell us about how Homeric epic constructed the past? How does this construction plug and play with the past few decades of scholarship on the archaic Greek sense of history? In brief, I believe the Sirens episode can enrich our understanding of these questions by drawing our focus to 3 ideas. First, narcissism. The Sirens appeal to Odysseus' vanity. They flatter him as the great glory of the Achaeans and promise to sing of all he did at Troy. They don't promise to sing about someone else's past. We're interested in ourselves and we love to relive our lives, especially our moments of glory. So we succumb to this temptation, either because we're entranced by our own literal reflection or because we're reflecting on the past. It's a version of the myth of Narcissus. It's death by self-absorption. Siegfried Waschwitz calls the Sirens' appeal the lure of lyric self-enchantment. Second, nostalgia. The term derives from the Greek nostos, return, and algos, pain. Nostalgia is a melancholy caused by prolonged absence from one's home or country, a longing for the conditions of past age, a wistful memory of an earlier time. It's the pain we receive not just from thinking about the past, but from being unable to relive it. Homeric heroes are nostalgic in this sense. To them, the past is always greener on the other side. Third, Edenic semiotics. To the literary critic Roman Jacobson, aesthetic language is marked by ambiguity and a self-focusing character. To literary theorist Umberto Eco, these are the qualities of Edenic language. Self-focusing and ambiguity are also qualities of the Sirens, their song, and its effect. Like the tempter in the biblical Eden, the Sirens promise total godlike knowledge, and their meadow, like the Garden of Eden, implies the color green. In Robert Fitzgerald's translation of the Odyssey, the Sirens sing of the past as a green mirror. Strikingly, in The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald renders the lure of the past in nearly identical terms as a reflected green light. Fitzgerald claimed that he only read Homer while writing The Great Gatsby, but scholars have found few echoes of Homer's poetry in the book. Glenn Settle sees Daisy as a siren figure, but does not link her lore to Gatsby's fixation on the past. Other scholars see the novel as concerned with the past, but do not connect that theme to Daisy's siren lore. Yet, in fact, Fitzgerald adapts both the promise and the peril of the siren song, specifically through Jay Gatsby's fraught relationship to time. The Great Gatsby echoes the Odyssey's siren episode in uncanny ways. Daisy lives on a deceptive flowering island that is also a valley of ashes. She maneuvers men into her deadly proximity, sometimes with the aid of a wind that blows and dies. She tempts the unwary to dock on her shore through flattery and the promise of a wondrous moment. In the scene where we meet Daisy, we even get the wine-dark waters Odysseus sailed. Quote, a wind from the window ripples over a wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea, unquote. The narrator hero Nick overcomes Daisy's enchanting vocalization in the same way that Odysseus defeats the sirens and with the same result, by a situational immobility which allows him to complete his post-war nostos. The deepest connection between Homer's sirens and Gatsby, however, is the fatal lore of the past. Like Odysseus's lost generation of sailors after the fall of Troy, Gatsby's lost generation can't go home again after World War I. And where the sirens tempt Odysseus by immersion in the heroic past, Daisy Buchanan lures Jay Gatsby into death by nostalgia. Yet, Daisy is not just a Greek monster in a flapper's dress. By creating his own Homeric narrative of Gatsby returning from war as a sailor stuck in the past, Fitzgerald reworks the siren myth and makes it his own. As their song defines the sirens, so Daisy's voice defines her character and role. The word voice appears 58 times in the text, more than almost any other noun, and Nick notes her sonic effect in almost every scene in which she appears. He calls her voice compelling, airy, low, watering, murmuring, musical, attractive, singing, thrilling, throbbing, heart-tugging, enchanting, transfixing, promising, insincere, deathless, and full of money. In the opening scene, Daisy's voice causes Nick to move toward her physically. Her voice is so captivating that men can only focus on its sound, not its sense. On Gatsby especially, its sound has a physical effect. Quote, as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. Her voice held him with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, unquote. With her voice, she even moves whole groups of men. When Gatsby and Daisy's husband, Tom, are unsure what to do in a tense moment, only her voice gets them to their feet. Daisy's voice defines not only her, but in effect, the men around her. Like the siren song, Daisy's voice is full of empty promises. She entices with the prospect of a bliss that never comes. Nick attributes her charm to an excitement in her voice, a singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise of exciting things hovering in the next hour. Gatsby succumbs to that promise because of his romantic nature. He is a hope addict. There was something gorgeous about him, Nick tells us, an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness. Gatsby's hope and Daisy's promise are a perfect and finally a fatal match. What Gatsby wants is a cosmic do-over, and Daisy ruins him by tempting him to live in a lost time. The word time appears 85 times in the text, even more than voice, and many of the characters stand in an uneasy relation to calendars and clocks. Gatsby first meets Daisy 5 years before the story starts. They fall in love, but he is sent overseas to fight in the war, and by the time he returns, she's married Tom Buchanan. When Gatsby pursues her anyway, Nick reminds him, you can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking there in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before. That grasping back for the past, just out of reach, informs the series of failed gestures that is Gatsby's personality. Quote, he stretched out his hand desperately as if to snatch only a wisp of air, to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best forever, unquote. When Gatsby first sees the green light at the end of Daisy's dock, his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him. As Nick says in the book's last line, Gatsby is a boat against the current, beating the wrong way back into the past. What Gatsby wants is beyond his reach because it already happened. In the closing paragraphs, Fitzgerald extends the siren motif to an entire culture and continent. Gatsby's unconquerable hope echoes the magical instant when Europeans first beheld North America. Nick describes the effect of that first Edenic vision as enchanting and compelling, which he also uses repeatedly to describe Daisy's voice. Long before Gatsby died on the old island, its streets had pandered in the siren-like whispers to the sailors who first saw the fresh, green breast of the New World. Daisy is for Gatsby what America was to the sailors who first saw it, and what the sirens were to Odysseus, the promise of an existence outside the normal rules of time. But just like a siren, Daisy leaves Gatsby a foolish, fallen sailor. The novel's marine imagery not only makes him a seafarer, but hints that he is symbolically drowned. America, too, ruins by inducing impossible hope. In America, hope is a lifestyle, a culture, a national character, almost a religion. Daisy's deathless song possesses a power above time, and that is the fatal lure of America, too, for old world Europeans like Gatsby's forebears. Gatsby uses his money to escape history, but other Americans escape history to make money. The green breast of the New World is also the color of cash, and so are the lawns that literally overcome time. Quote, the lawn started at the beach and ran, jumping over sundials, unquote. A determination to defeat time has lured many voluntary immigrants to dive misplaced hope in what Nick calls the dark fields of the Republic. The fields are dark not just because they're in the past, but because they have doomed so many who dreamed the American dream to live on lawns of money beyond the bounds of time. Nick survives to tell us this cautionary tale because he's immobilized like Odysseus. Since Daisy is his cousin, he cannot really pursue her in a man-woman way because of the societal incest taboo. Besides, she's already taken twice over by Gatsby and Tom. Those realities have the effect of binding Nick to the mast, allowing him to experience the siren song without going overboard. And so he lives to tell us what she sang. Like Odysseus, Nick is a storyteller returning from a voyage of initiation. Wiser for his woe, he can come back home. I'd like to make two concluding points. First, I don't want to suggest that I've exhausted all the analytical possibilities of the siren myth in either of these texts. Among other questions which I think remain open is this. If Fitzgerald borrowed the siren imagery from Homer, was he also inspired by a retelling of the Odyssey which we know he read before writing Gatsby, namely James Joyce's Ulysses? Second, I'd like to reflect on what the sirenic parallels between Gatsby and the Odyssey can tell us about the human condition. Tempted by sirens to relive their own pasts, Odysseus and Gatsby each invite comparison to Narcissus, who starved through enchantment with his own reflection. In both texts, the sirens sing a past that is enchanting but insincere. In both, the narrator heroes encounter siren figures on flowering islands, which are really wastelands of bones and ashes. Both Bronze Age Greeks and Jazz Age Americans construct their pasts in boastful performances at gatherings, mixing alcohol and music. They stage origin stories and war narratives as exempla of cosmic favor, betokened by wealth and fame, but unleavened by love. In both narratives, events are overdetermined by pasts that are close in time but distant in spirit. The past thereby becomes a distorting lens, representing not reality, but the wish to remake it in the image of individual hope. These parallels suggest to me that archaic and modern societies share a common construction of the past. The Edenic semiotics of the green mirror and the green light are telling. The past as paradise is just as compelling as what Milton called pastures new. Living in the past is a temptation we find impossible to realize, yet impossible to resist. In that sense, nostalgia symbolizes the human condition itself. We have bodies of beasts, but the dreams of gods. Our reach will always exceed our grasp. The siren song calls us to a godlike perspective that is tragically beyond our capacities to achieve, yet commensurate to our capacity for wonder. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing now. That way I can see everyone on the screen.
Thank you so much, Eden. What an interesting idea. There's a lot of enthusiasm for your comparison in the chat, if you're able to see that.
I can't see the chat, but the chat on the Zoom or on the web
on
page?
the stream.
Oh,
But
okay.
there's a lot of great enthusiasm
That's
there.
great to hear.
So, one moment. Um, so we do have questions. Um, you've mentioned in your discussion of sort of the background, the building up of the siren figure, the literary tradition of the temptress monster and the sirens as an enduring form of that archetype. So what comes to mind as other outcomes of that archetype that you might compare it to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, I'm not an expert in myth and folklore, but there are some archetypes in the Odyssey itself. Circe, the witch, is one of the witch lady. She's one of them that comes to mind, and Calypso, the seductress, isn't a monster per se, but she imprisons the hero with her charms. So, I mean, I'd say that's kind of close. But it's really the motif of um the siren that I think is one of the most enduring forms handed down from Homer to Virgil to Dante, and finally to Fitzgerald, which I think is really a present form of that. But yeah, I would say that definitely Circe and Calypso, they're definitely both presented as women who are deceptive, tempting, and at first they seem to mean well, but then they lure you in. And Calypso um, kept Odysseus captive on his island, on her island for 7 years. So, I mean, I think these two are probably the best examples I could think of besides sirens.
Um, we also have a question about the American dream and how that sort of fits into this whole narrative, right? So when you're talking about Nostos, you're talking about the the return and the dream of the past in some way. But the American dream, which is something that Fitzgerald obviously wants to comment on as well,
Yeah.
is is almost in some ways the opposite of that. It's the dream of the impossible future. So how do those sort of fit together?
Well, Fitzgerald making the comparison, I think he's making probably the points that first, I mean, the lore is seductive and deceptive. I mean, America promises one thing but delivers another. Um, and it's a temporary feeling that's mistaken for a lasting possibility. Behind the fresh green breast of the New World is a valley of ashes in the Great Gatsby. And like Daisy, the siren call of America is more sound than sense. It's vulgar, kind of in a way, meretricious, and it's the sound of money. Similarly, I think. Secondly, um, Americans like Gatsby have a flawed relationship to time. They kind of problematize time and try to live beyond its rules. Living in the future instead of in the present is just as irrational as trying to live in the past. And the very American idea that you can change the past by reinventing yourself, like Gatsby tries to do, and be different than you were before, is kind of wrong because I mean you're still yourself even if you change your name from Gats to Gatsby and make up an origin story that you went to Oxford. So I think just kind of to wrap up what I was saying, Americans might not be living in the past, but they're definitely lived by the past. Maybe if only in the sense to desperately try to escape it. I mean, like Gatsby, Americans want a cosmic do-over. So I think that's how that this ties into the American dream, at least as Fitzgerald conceived it 100 years ago.
So I'm very interested in what caught your attention to this green mirror. I find that very compelling as a reader of The Great Gatsby, and I had not really thought to compare it to the Nostos of Odysseus. So how did you come to that in your research, in your reading?
So I actually read The Great Gatsby in 10th grade English class. And we were reading it right after we read the Odyssey. So I kind of had the Odyssey in my mind a little bit.
Mm,
Um, and so I think the first thing that caught my mind was the wine dark rug, that
mm.
phrase, because my teacher always talked about Homeric epithets and the wine dark sea. We talked about that all the time. So when I saw wine dark, I immediately connected it to Homer. And then I was kind of on the lookout for um, things that related to what I saw in Homer. And just the way that sorry, not Gatsby, that Daisy, her voice was portrayed in one of the first scenes, actually. That caught my eye because I had actually written um, a poem on sirens. So I had done a little bit of studying them. We had done a little bit of a unit of that in class. So I immediately recognized from the way her voice was being described as, you know, compelling and airy, watering, and Nick moving towards her physically and her enchanting people around her, and that men could only focus on the sound of the voice and follow the rhythm up and down, not on the actual sense of the words she was saying. That just connected right away for me. And I kind of just saw that those two as a comparison, you know, Daisy is a siren. And then I researched a little bit into Fitzgerald. I was sure he probably read Homer, but you know, I just wanted to make sure. And then I found out he was only reading Homer at the time he wrote The Great Gatsby, or so he claimed. So then I started trying to look for other things that you know related to Homer and The Great Gatsby, and from that I kind of looked at Nick and Gatsby both as versions of Odysseus, but Nick as a version of Odysseus that is able to actually, you know, move past the Siren Island. He's bound to the mast and he actually doesn't drown. But then Gatsby is the version that's stuck in the past, the version of Odysseus that can't get past the Trojan War, who's so enthralled by it. And he is so tempted to hear about the secrets of Troy. And that's always something that's going to be in the back of his mind. And Nick as the version that, you know, he can move on and get past his past, whereas Gatsby tries to repeat the past. And as Nick says in the last line of the book, and as I mentioned, he is like a boat against the current, beating back ceaselessly into the past.
Yeah, very Odyssean sentiment, as you said.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much for your talk. That was really
of
interesting and
course.
a great presentation.
Thank
So
you.
thank you for joining
Thank you
us.
so much.